Good evening. It is, well, I sure hope it's July 6th. Wednesday, July 6th, 2022. Um, and it is good to be able to stream. Uh, a week ago, I was barely talking, I think, so it's good to be able to do a little bit tonight. Um, I do want to encourage you if you have any updates on the prayer list, names to add, or anything like that, please let me know. You can do so by texting there or doing a comment. And I think that I could read comments from either Facebook or YouTube um, on this thing. I think. Okay. So I will mention one thing. Jim did get to go home. Um, Apparently, about the only thing they really did maybe was kind of get his diabetes a little bit more regulated. But other than that, they didn't seem to find anything else out. Um, Others, we still got some folks dealing with COVID, and it's lingering effects, I guess. Um, I'm still dealing with cough or um, whatever, scratchy throat kind of thing. Um, but it's vastly improved. I gotta tell you, at one point I thought maybe I had a new career opportunity open to me. My voice was so messed up I could have sung bass in a Southern gospel quartet. But alas, that has gone away now that I've gotten better. Um, so anyway, not that I'm saying that was a direction I really wanted to go. I'm just saying, at that point, I, yeah, was was talking really low. Okay, so tonight we're gonna continue in Matthew chapter 26, and we'll be starting in verse 34, and well, that's not what that says. It's 36 through 56. And so if you have your Bibles, I'll give you a minute to find that spot to follow along, beginning again in Matthew 26, verse 36, on through verse 56. And again, I remind you, if you do have some names to add to the prayer list or updates, please go ahead and add that. I'm wondering, are you hearing me? Okay, I hear me. So, all right. So I assume you can too. All right. Again, Matthew 26, verse 36. Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he told the disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." Taking along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said, "Excuse me, I need to turn off something." Going a little farther, excuse me, taking along Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. He said to them, I am deeply grieved to the point of death. Remain here and stay awake with me. Going on a little farther, he fell face down and prayed, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping. He asked Peter, So, couldn't you stay awake with me 1 hour? Stay awake and pray so that you won't enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Again, a second time he went away and prayed, My Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. And he came again and found them sleeping, because they could not keep their eyes open. After leaving them, he went away again and prayed a third time, saying the same thing once more. Then he came to the disciples and said to them, Are you still sleeping and resting? See, the time is near. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. See, my betrayer is near. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, suddenly arrived. A large mob with swords and clubs was with him from the chief priests and elders of the people. His betrayer had given them a sign, The one I kiss, he's the one. Arrest him. So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. Friend, Jesus asked him, Why have you come? Then they came up, took hold of Jesus, and arrested him. At that moment, one of those with Jesus reached out his hand and drew his sword. He struck the high priest's servant and cut off his ear. Then Jesus told him, Put your sword back in its place, because all who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will provide me here and now with more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way? At that time Jesus said to the crowds, Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal to capture me? Every day I used to sit teaching in the temple, and you didn't arrest me. But all this has happened so that the writing of the prophets would be fulfilled. Then all the disciples deserted him and ran away. All right. So good evening, Larry. The place where the disciples and Jesus went is Gethsemane. It's a garden or a wooded area. The name means oil press, and there were groves of olive trees around there, and many of these groves were owned by prominent families in Jerusalem. And this particular place was known to Jesus and his disciples. There were very likely other people in this area, not just Jesus and his disciples, but they went to a particular place that was known to Judas as well as the rest of the disciples. And so they left the rest of the disciples behind. So Peter and the inner circle, Peter, James, and John. Did I say Peter? But Jesus and those 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, went a little farther. And then he asked them to watch and pray while he went on a little farther by himself. And when he asked them to watch, he's apparently asked them to be alert, to be awake, and pray themselves. And here's a thought. If Jesus wanted others to pray with him, then that ought to be, I guess, an indication for us that it's important to share our prayer burdens with others as well. He's distressed. It literally says sorrowful and troubled, overwhelmed and sorrowful. He's fully aware of his coming death, and he's aware of the greater suffering that he'll endure when he bears our sins upon himself. It's not just about the means of execution, although that will be physically a horrible thing, but in particular the other suffering is even greater, bearing the sins of the world. A couple of other translations use terms like crushed with anguish or terrible distress and misery. And that's the basis for him being overwhelmed to the point of death. And his prayer is that if it's possible, take the cup away. The cup, and we've mentioned this before, no doubt, has to do with the wrath of God that was being poured out, the wrath of God the cup that Jesus would shortly drink. He knows of his coming suffering, and being human, there's nothing sinful about asking if there's a way to avoid drinking that cup. Um, and when he says if it's possible, he knows within the power of God, uh, the omnipotent power of God, that it clearly would be possible. But yet he also understands that everything that's possible may not fit in with God's ultimate will, God's ultimate plan. And so the conclusion of the matter is, not my will, but your will be done. And by the way, we might wonder why or how Matthew knew what Jesus was saying in this prayer. After all, he was not there. He wasn't even with the three that went asleep. But either Jesus told them all later, during his 40 days post-resurrection, those appearances and times he spent with them, or it's possible that the other three were awake here and there, or heard enough of some of the prayers of Jesus to understand the gist of it. But certainly we understand also that this is the inspired Word of God. So if no other option is available to us, God would have told Matthew what was said. And something else we ought to grab hold of here is that if Jesus himself could pray this way, telling God his deepest desires and concluding with, but your will be done, then that ought to be a good way for us to pray as well. We can tell God exactly our deepest desires, but we also need to be willing to surrender to God's ultimate perfect will. And when Jesus returns to the three disciples, it's probably been about an hour. Couldn't you stay awake an hour? He finds them all asleep. He gives them a mild rebuke and challenges them again to be alert and pray. The temptation they're facing really is one to deny Christ. So pray that when the time comes, you can resist that temptation. And by the way, even this rebuke, even this falling asleep is a pretty sharp contrast with the boast they've had earlier. After all, they said, we'll never abandon you. But in a way, they've already abandoned him when they go to sleep during this time. So once again, Jesus withdraws and prays again. This time, he seems to have understood that it's perhaps not within God's will that he not drink of this cup. If it's not your will, he says. So that may indicate that he has a recognition this is not God's will that he avoid the cup. And still he affirms that he wants to carry out God's ultimate will. And again, drinking the cup has to do with carrying out God's will, drinking the cup of the wrath of God. But he's willing to undergo that suffering and death. And again, he goes back and finds the disciples are already asleep. It doesn't seem like he wakes them up this time. But he goes back and prays the same thing again, as we're told. This time when he returns and finds the disciples asleep, he wakes them up with a rhetorical question. Are you still sleeping and resting? Obviously, they were, because they're asleep. But he alerts them now to the arrival of Judas. Betrayer has come. The hour has come. The decisive moment has come. It's time for them to get up and meet the betrayer and those with him. And he's not courting death or seeking it, but he's not going to run from it. He's not going to avoid the decisive moment for which he's come. And while he's still speaking, Judas has come. And Matthew highlights that he's one of the 12. We know he's one of the 12, but he's calling attention to the irony and the tragedy of one of that the very group of the 12 that have been with Jesus all this time uh, is the one who's betrayed him. And he shows up with people armed and ready to fight like he's some dangerous rebel. Uh, and perhaps that highlights a fear that the Jewish leaders have, that Jesus will somehow emerge from this disguise that perhaps he's worn, and rally the people to rebel. And by the way, when we see the swords and the daggers, knives, that confirms that there's at least some Roman soldiers who are present. And the clubs would seem to indicate some kind of rabble made up of perhaps some riffraff as well as temple guards. The swords and daggers would have been the weapons of the Romans generally, while the clubs would have been the weapons of perhaps the riffraff and maybe the temple guards. We might wonder why anybody has to identify Jesus. Well, perhaps that Jesus and these other Galileans would look very similar, and especially it's dark. And again, as we've mentioned a while ago, there may be other groups of people there there on the Mount of Olives. So the fact that Jesus would be pointed out specifically by means of a kiss, that may have been necessary, and also understand that a kiss was a normal greeting for men in the ancient Middle East, and it still is in many parts of the world today. Another thing that's interesting is that once again, Judas uses the term rabbi and not Lord, while others could call him Lord. He could only call him teacher. And in verse 50, it's also interesting to note that Jesus uses the term friend. And that's kind of a distancing word. In fact, it's still kind of a distancing word today. How many times do we see someone on TV that we've never met before who addresses us as friend? Friend, I'm here to tell you that this product is the best ever. And sometimes we might see it when somebody addresses us as friend that we've never met, and that they're not calling us friend at all. Friend, you need to learn how to drive your car. Or friend, you need to back off. Or friend, you're being pretty rude right now. Whatever. And perhaps it was a little bit that way when Jesus addressed Judas as friend. So what he says to Judas, do you come here? Or why are you here? Or whatever, however it's mentioned in different translations, and that really kind of highlights the different possibilities of Jesus' reply to Judas. It could be seen as a command: do what you're here for. A statement: I know what you're here for. Or a question: what are you here for? And obviously, in any of those deals, it's not about Jesus being ignorant, but simply a way to highlight the guilt of the evil that Judas is doing. And by the way, just a reminder again, what Judas is doing and what the people are coming to do is part of God's overall plan. It's necessary, but that still doesn't mean it's not evil. That still does not mean the people that arrested Jesus, that the betrayal of Jesus by Judas is not evil, and that those who do it are still accountable for their actions. Well, as the men step forward to arrest Jesus, it turns out that at least one of Jesus' disciples is armed. From the Gospel of John, we know that it's Peter. We also know from that same account that the servant that's injured is Malchus, and that he's immediately healed by Jesus. Um, Maybe Peter took something that Jesus had said about swords a little literally. Um, and it's Luke that tells us that the servant was healed immediately. And what follows and what Jesus said, he makes it plain that he will not fight back or resist in any way what is necessary to fulfill the Father's will. To fulfill the Father's will. That includes his death, his arrest and death on the cross. He also makes it completely clear that he's still in charge. Uh, these men that are coming to arrest him really have no ultimate power. He makes it clear that he is completely within his power to ask the Father, and he would send more than 12 legions of angels. That would be literally more than 72,000 angels uh, to rescue him. By the way, when he says that those who live by the sword will die by the sword, he's not necessarily commanding pacifism from now on, but he is instead letting us know that violence only leads to more violence. That's something important to keep in mind. Um, and in the last few verses, it seems like Jesus is making fun of those who have come to arrest him, uh, and really of the Jewish leaders and the crowd that's come. He said, "Am I leading some kind of revolt here? That you've got to come out with swords and torches and clubs to arrest me?" I'm going to paraphrase it here. Dude, I've been in the temple every day, publicly teaching. You could have easily come at any moment to arrest me. But no, you've got to come out at nighttime, away from the eyes of others, to take me like a thief or a rebel. But again, in that final statement, he says, but this is all being done to fulfill what's been prophesied. You know, earlier I kind of mentioned the fact that, in a way, by going to sleep, this inner circle have already betrayed their vows of faithfulness simply by going to sleep. But now it's made even more profound. That is their failure to live up to their vow, when it said all the disciples deserted him and fled. Even the one that said, I'll never go. Even if everybody else goes, I'm going to be there. But yet he's gone, just like the others. So what are some things we can maybe take hold of, to take with us from this passage? Well, I think one thing is we can see sometimes it's good, sometimes it's necessary and important to withdraw for time of prayer. And when we're in the deepest pit, instead of whining to everybody else or having a pity party, getting on Facebook and telling everybody how terrible things are, pray. Jesus did it. It's important for us. And then also related to that same idea is, if it was important for Jesus to have others to watch and pray with him, it's a good thing for us as well. There's something encouraging and empowering to know that others are praying for you. And I think also in this we see it's important in our prayers to be ready to surrender to God's will, not our own. I've heard people say, you should never pray, if it be your will, Lord. But yet Jesus prayed that way. And I'm going to follow Jesus' example before I listen to some other man's opinion that I shouldn't pray like Jesus prayed. Okay. I also want to say that we cannot prevent, man cannot hinder God's ultimate will from being accomplished. Now, I want to say that again. Man cannot hinder God's ultimate will from being accomplished. Now, we can make some decisions along the way that we want to be part of it or not. And I want to tell you that being part of it is a whole lot better than not being part of it, okay? But also, keep in mind also that sometimes part of God's ultimate will being fulfilled may include some things that seem bad to us. For instance, it certainly seemed bad to the disciples for Jesus to be arrested, taken away, and then crucified. Yet it was ultimately part of God's means to bring about the salvation of man. It seemed like a horrible thing, but it was necessary. And sometimes we may go through some difficult times for us to be prepared, or for us to be cleansed or purified, or to be put in a place where we can be part of God's ultimate will being accomplished. The scripture is full of times when, quote, bad things were happening to some of God's people, but yet God was still in charge, and He had a plan and a purpose, and it was accomplished. How many of the first disciples endured suffering, even death, to glorify God? Going back to the Old Testament, I think of Joseph, all that he went through, being sold into slavery by his own brothers, becoming a slave, and then accused falsely of crime, thrown into prison, and forgotten. But yet, God used him wherever he was along the way. But all of that was preparation for delivering nations, including his own people, from great famine. All right. So, let me ask again, do we have any additions to the prayer list? I mentioned a while ago, I'll mention again, Jim did get to go home from the hospital. I know Thomas has been having a pretty rough time, but he was feeling some better. And Vicky and Jerry as well. And Vicky was having a pretty tough time, but I think they have felt better some today. And so there's some good reports. I haven't talked to Holly, but I did talk to Joe, and he said Holly was doing better. And apparently none of the kids got sick, so that's good. Um, Also want to remember the family of a lady named Granva. Many of you will know her. A longtime resident of Jones Creek, and I believe some of my cousins knew her pretty well. Let me look and see if anything is jumping out at me. You know, it's kind of interesting. I may have mentioned this a time or two before. I'll just mention this while I give you another chance to maybe add a prayer concern if you have one. Back in the earlier days of COVID, we had several individuals that got sick here and there, but it was usually, only 2 or 3 at a time. This time, where we think we're over the worst of it, man, we had a bunch of folks get it at the same time. In fact, not only here, but I know, and as far as I know, the strain of catching it was not related, but there were several folks from other churches, at least one other church that had it, as well as other ministries. Now that other ministry we may have been related in the strain we caught. I'm not really sure, but man, we think we're over it, and boom, it's close to home with quite a few of us. I think we had 7 or 8 folks at one time that had it, and I know there were some others that had it just before then, and they got through it.